Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar of the Spring College Admissions webinar series for the Paradigm Scholars. My name is Chuck Lydiard, and we're glad to have you joining us tonight. I know that people might be joining us from different time zones and different parts of the US and maybe the world. So we want to thank you for this this part of your day today and or evening, I should say. And we are going to probably have a few late arrivals, but I do value your time and I value our presenters' time as well. So we're just going to go ahead and get started here now. And want to let you know if you are not familiar with the Paradigm Scholars, this is a 501c3 nonprofit that I founded in 2017. And our mission is really to help provide affordable, consistent guidance to help students discover their why for college. And we help students to develop a challenge mindset, an aptitude mindset, and an entrepreneurial mindset through virtual and one-on-one programming that we offer our students who want to essentially take the college admission journey and take it by the reins and to own their process. So we have more information later on about more of our programming that I will send to you. And I just want to let you know a little bit about myself, because in addition to the Paradigm Scholars, I have had over 10 years of college admission background and college admissions background and experience. I worked for Virginia Commonwealth and the University of Delaware, and I also currently work at Vistamar School, which is an independent high school just south of Los Angeles Airport in El Segundo, California. So I really am coming about this with many different viewpoints, both from the college side, both also from working one-on-one with students at the independent high school side. And I also have been a coach and a high school athletic director as well. And I take my professional development very seriously to bring the most cutting edge, the most important recent trends and important information to the families and students that we work with. And this is how you can reach me afterwards. I'll have this afterwards after the webinar too, if you have any questions. I do have, since many of you are potential college-bound student athletes, I do have a great resource guide that you can scan and get a free PDF full of great resources. And like I said, we're going to be uploading a video of this webinar and resources provided by our presenter in our Heartbeat community platform, which I'll email you more information on that as well. We do have some other upcoming webinars as well. They tend to fall on Wednesdays, and you'll get more information if you haven't already seen some emails coming out from Future Champions of Golf. But we have a great one on financial aid, making college affordable for all income levels from Trevor Mazzari. He's the president and founder of Premier College Guidance out of the San Fernando Valley in California. And I'm going to be the host of two other ones, one in late May and one in late June, developing an A-plus game plan to help your student athlete become discovered. And my last webinar is going to be 5 game-changing resources that will help you to own your college process. And I'm proud to be a vendor also at the Future Champions Golf Callaway World Championship event. That's going to be at the Westin and Rancho Mirage, July 13th and 14th. So I hope I can meet you in person. Well, I am very excited to welcome our guest speaker for this evening, Mrs. Katy Langhorst. Katy is the Vice President of Partnerships with StudyPoint Tutoring. Katy works with schools, states, teachers, and a wide range of organizations to provide support for students across the country through academic tutoring, SAT and ACT prep, study skills, and executive functioning coaching, a phonics-based elementary reading program, and admissions consulting. Before joining StudyPoint in 2010, Katy had spent 13 years in the world of education, including 5 years as a public school teacher. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Child Psychology from Yale University and a master's degree in elementary education from Lesley University. Katy currently serves on the boards of several nonprofits as well. And before I turn the presentation over to Katy, I do want to kind of get an idea of who's actually joining us live here. So I'm going to launch a poll. And if you guys don't mind to just tell us a little bit about either yourself, if you're a student, or if you're a parent of a student. We're just kind of want to get to know of the graduation year of the student, if you are a student, or the child that you're here representing. So if you could just answer the graduation year, just so we know who we're talking to, that'd be great. All right. I'm going to end the poll here, and we'll share the results here. Looks like we have uh, parent or students of current freshmen and eighth graders as well here. So that's great to know. Thank you so much. And at this time, I'm going to stop sharing the poll result, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm now going to turn it over to our guest speaker, Katy Langhorst. Thanks, Katy.
Terrific. Thanks, Chuck. It's great to be here with everybody tonight. And I'm excited to cover a pretty wide range of topics around sort of the broader topic of testing. It sounds like a bunch of you have younger children, which is great. You're getting a real jump start on this changing world of admissions testing. But we're really going to talk about kind of three main topics tonight. One is test optional is obviously a very common buzzword in the world of education currently and has been for the last few years. And we're going to dig under the covers a little bit and really understand, what does that mean? What does it mean for students? What does it mean for colleges? And what have been kind of the trends and changes in the last 5 years? Then we'll kind of shift gears to SAT versus ACT, the age-old rivalry of which one should you focus on, and especially, again, for the folks with younger kids, starting to think ahead to which one you might want to prepare for, which one you might want to focus on. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about some timelines for if you are a freshman, a sophomore, a junior, what's the best kind of thought process for laying out a timeline for preparing for the tests. If you have questions as we go through, there's a chat box at the very bottom of your screen. You can submit those as we go. Chuck's going to monitor them for me. And if it's a question that kind of goes with what I'm talking about, I told him he's free to interrupt me. And so we can talk through specific questions. Or if it's something that I'm going to get to later in the presentation, we'll hold off and answer them a little bit later. So with that, let's talk for a bit first about test optional. So I want to really hit on two things here. One is, how have testing requirements changed since 2020, which for obvious reasons was the beginning of a real sea change in the world of college admissions testing. And then what are the current trends that we're seeing as we sit here in 2025? One thing I didn't mention earlier was I am also a parent. So I'm right in the middle of this process with you. I have a senior who, as Chuck and I were just chatting about, is in the midst of his final decisions. And then I have a sophomore coming up right behind him. So I've not only been living and working in this world for 15 plus years, but also now sitting on the other side of the table as a parent. Okay, so what's changed in the last 5 years, and kind of how has the world of college admissions testing shifted? So the biggest change has been the rise of test optional admissions policies, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second. That existed prior to 2020 for sure. There were a decent sized handful of schools that were test optional, even a few that were test blind prior to the pandemic, but it was a fairly small list. During the pandemic, obviously kids could not test. Testing centers were closed. Nobody wanted 500 kids in a high school gym. So there was a huge shift towards test optional. And that lasted pretty much across almost all colleges through 2020, 21, some into 2022. And then we've seen a bit of a shift back, and we'll talk through that in a second. So that's been really a sea change in the world of admissions and has had a bunch of implications beyond just the actual tests and how many students take them and submit scores. It's really had pretty big ripple effects across the entire industry of admissions. The other thing that has changed since 2020 is back in 2021, the College Board ended the SAT essay with a few exceptions for state testing and ended the subject tests. So some of the parents in the room may remember taking the SAT subject tests. For a while, they were called the SAT 2s. They were focused on one subject, math, biology, English. Those are now entirely gone. And then in 2023, as many of you I'm sure heard, the Supreme Court banned colleges from using race as a factor in admissions. So that was another pretty big sea change in how many schools conducted admissions. Then last year in 2024, we had the rollout of the digital SAT, first test to go fully digital, and a bunch of changes related to that we'll hit on. And then finally, this current year, right, kind of as we speak, the ACT is going through its own shift to both a shorter and revised test and a digital format. So it's been a lot. Those are any one of those would have been big news in the world of college admissions. To have 5 or 6 of them all in the span of a couple of years has really been a pretty big set of changes. Let's talk definitions for a minute. So test optional, again, I'm sure you've heard that term. It's thrown around a lot, but just to make sure we level set on what it means, a school, a college or university that's test optional is saying, you may submit us a test, we will look at it, we will factor it into our admissions, but at least officially, we will not hold it against you if you do not submit a test. We'll talk a little bit more about how that plays out, but that's what the policy means. There's a new term that I just saw for the first time in the last couple months, which is test conditional, which is sort of a sub flavor of test optional, which means if your student meets certain criteria, typically GPA related, then we don't need to see a test. So if your student is a 3.5 GPA or higher, we don't need a test. If you're under 3.5, we want to see an SAT or ACT. So there's a handful of schools using that as their new rule. Test flexible is another one that's kind of increasing in popularity in this admission cycle. Test flexible means the school is not requiring an SAT or an ACT, but they do want to see some kind of testing. So if you either don't have or don't want to submit an SAT or ACT score, they have a list of other choices, primarily AP exams, typically more than one. In some cases, the exams through the IB system, the IB exams as well. So those schools are kind of saying, we care about testing, but we know that SAT and ACT aren't the only game in town. If you don't have those, give us something else. Then there are schools that have gone to this test preferred, which is kind of an interesting one, which is we don't technically require a score for admission, but we really want to see one. So, again, you can kind of read between the lines there. They would like to be test required, but for reasons we'll talk about in a second, they are not at the moment. So there's a handful of schools that are test preferred, meaning if there's a really good reason you didn't test, okay, tell us about it. Otherwise, we want to see a test score. And then there's a chunk of schools, and it's a shifting number, but that are truly test blind. The biggest of those are the UC and the Cal State systems that literally will not look at a test. There's nowhere to put it in the application. If you try to sneak it into your essay, they will literally black it out or delete it. So they will not look at tests. Again, that's primarily the UC system, the Cal State system, and then a handful of other colleges around the country. So those are kind of the definitions that sort of set the playing field for what's happened in college admissions. But one question parents often ask me is, why did schools go test optional? Or really, why did they stay test optional? They went test optional in many cases because of the practicalities of the pandemic. And schools will tell you, and I think that they do mean it, although it's a little bit deceptive, that they did it for kind of compassion and equity reasons, that they know that a test does not tell you everything about a student. I 100% agree with that. And that therefore they wanted to give students more flexibility, increase equity in college admissions, decrease the focus on testing, decrease student stress is something some schools will say. I do think all of those reasons are part of why they're doing it. The reason why these policies have stuck really is a lot more of a numbers game. So as you'll see in a moment, I have some graphs to share with you. The rise in test optional has led to a dramatic surge in the number of applications, particularly competitive colleges are receiving. They're getting way more applicants because the test score no longer serves as kind of a gatekeeper or a barrier to entry. So because way more students are applying to these schools, now their acceptance rate, their selectivity looks way lower, right? The schools didn't change, but if they're getting 50% more people to apply, they still have the same number of slots in their freshman class, the same number of dorm rooms, the same number of seats in their classroom. So they're accepting smaller and smaller percentages of students. That makes them look more selective and helps them in a bunch of ways. It's also affected their ranking. So the schools that have gone test optional, because of these dynamics of looking more selective, are now finding that their rankings, which still are kind of the gold standard for better or for worse in college admissions, are shifting alongside of it. So what started out as a pandemic related kind of practical issue shifted into this compassionate equity, kind of level the playing field sort of approach that has now turned into really a very interesting kind of numbers and economic game. So the way these test optional policies have played out for schools, as I said, are huge increases in applications. We'll look at some in a second. Some schools are up 40, 50, 60% in terms of the number of students applying. Every student also comes with an application fee, from $30 or $40 to $100. Those fees are not an insignificant source of revenue for schools. So that helps them too. If they have 50% more kids applying, that's more application fees they're collecting. There's also been a real surge, and we'll look at this in a second, in schools' use of early decision, early action to fill their classes. We'll talk in a second about that and what that means, but it's been a very marked trend recently that schools are filling bigger chunks of their class from those early pools. Because of both of those things, there's been this record-breaking drop in acceptance rates. Watching the news come in from schools in the last couple of weeks in this current cycle, a lot of them are saying it's their lowest acceptance percentage ever. So this trend is kind of continuing over the years. Schools are also using their wait lists more because all of these changes, as unsettling as they have been to us as parents, have really messed with the school's math equations. They used to know, okay, if we get 5,000 applications and we accept 1,000, we know, 700 are going to show up on the first day of freshman year. They had very set kind of metrics and equations to figure out how their math worked. The pandemic really threw all of that up in the air and everything fell down differently. So schools still need to fill the same number of seats. They don't want to end up with too many kids or too few kids at the beginning of school. So they're using their wait lists more strategically to try to kind of guard against those changes and make sure they end up with a class that they want. And that's affecting students as well. Let's look at some charts and graphs. So I promise not too much math, but just a little bit. Applications are way up. So this is just the number of first-year applications submitted across the country to any school at all. So you can see if you look back at 4 or 5 years ago, it was in the 6 million-ish range. Look at this. We're all the way up to over 8 million applications submitted. So it's up about 34% since 2020. That's a huge change, right? There aren't more students. In fact, I meant to look this up, but I think that the demographics of my student's class, he's a senior, there are actually fewer 17, 18-year-olds than in prior years. And I think that dip continues with the coming classes. So it's not that there are more kids, it's that there are more applications being submitted. And that's primarily happening at competitive schools. So this is just sort of a sampling of schools. You'll see these same names over and over, in part because this set of 7 schools, represents a pretty decent range of acceptance levels, and they publish lots of data, which I like. So they make it easy. Not every school will answer questions like, what percentage of students are you accepting from your early pool? So the selection of schools on the next couple slides is partly because we have access to their data. But what this slide is showing you is how many applications did each of these 7 schools get in 2020 in the greenish bar, all the way through 2023. I don't have 2024, 25 data in here yet, but you can see the jumps. You also may notice a few went down a little bit in last year's admission cycle. We'll talk about why in a second, but you'll notice that a couple peaked in 2 years ago and then went down a little bit last year. But overall, you can see they've had this giant surge. And I mean, look at some of these schools, like UVA, they're getting 44% more applicants than they were a few years ago. And I bet this year it'll be even higher. So it's really changing their world. That's 44% more applications they have to read. They have to staff their admissions office for. There's been a lot of reports of schools spending less time per application because they just have 44% more of them. It's a real practical change in the way they run their admissions. The other big thing that's driving this change is the average college apps per student is up 19%. And again, this is last year's data. I wouldn't be surprised if it's up a few more percent this year. So students used to apply on average across all students, all competitive levels, to something in the range of 5-ish schools, and now they're up to 6 to 7 schools. That does not sound like a lot, but again, that's ripple effects that ripples through the entire system. Students applying to competitive colleges now on average apply to 12 schools. That's a lot of schools. And again, it's because as the acceptance rates are going down, admissions is getting and feeling less predictable for students. Again, I can speak from firsthand experience. It's hard to know how this is going to play out. So students are hedging their bets by applying to more schools. So it's becoming a bit of a kind of self-perpetuating cycle. Admissions is getting more uncertain. Therefore, students are applying to more schools, which means schools are getting more applications, which is making it more uncertain. Just math, obviously also acceptance rates are way down. So because they're getting more applications, as I said, they don't have more seats or more beds in their dorms, so they're accepting fewer and fewer students. Again, many schools are reporting record-breaking low acceptance rates of this current year as well. This is a super interesting trend to me. So the schools are fulfilling a bigger and bigger percentage of their classes from the early pool. So the orange bars here are in the 2019 season, so pre-pandemic, what percentage of their class was admitted early. And that could be early decision, early action. Some schools have early decision too, any early plan at all. And then in the most recent class this past year, what percentage of their class is admitted early? Look at UVA. UVA for the 2025 season admitted 81% of their class through early plans. That's kind of crazy. And you think about the math there and what it does to their acceptance rate in the regular pool. It's really hard now to get into UVA period, but particularly to get into UVA regular, because they've already filled 80% of their seats by the time they're looking at those regular decision applications. So super interesting just to see the kind of rise in early plans and how big a factor these are for schools. Schools love early decision and early action because their yield is much better. Because early decision, you are committing to go to the school, they know that you're going to come. So some of their math equation of how many kids are going to want us that we want gets easier if they use those early pools. So it's a really important tool for schools. And that, again, has shifted how things are playing out. But the problem is, at the same time that schools had been moving away from tests, there's a real significant grade inflation situation going on in this country. So this is the percentage of freshmen at four-year universities who report, and this is self-reported data, that they had an A plus, an A, or an A minus average in high school. And obviously there's a little gap in there from COVID where many schools went pass fail. But again, as of 2023, almost 86% of kids at four-year schools said that in high school they had an A minus or higher average. You compare that to back in the 60s, holy moly, totally different world. Even 5 or 6 years ago, it was more like in the 50 and 60% range. So the problem here for admissions officers and for therefore students and families is saying, okay, my kid has an A average, no longer it allows them to distinguish between students. You know, schools that my son was applying to said they could fill their class 5 times over with kids with straight A averages. So now they are losing those grades as a reliable measure. And in some cases, they don't have test scores. It's making decisions really, really challenging. And it's making predicting those decisions very challenging. At the same time that those grade increases are happening, look what's happening to average ACT composite score. So it's not that the kids today are learning more, doing better, are smarter and brighter and killing it. I wish that were true. It's actually not true. It is that ACT composite scores are falling as grades are rising, which tells you that there's a significant grade inflation situation happening here. It's not reflecting better skills of students in 2023 versus 1990. It's reflecting a change in grading philosophy. So again, it's putting schools in a difficult spot. This is kind of a complicated graph, but parents often ask me about it. So that's why I'm pulling it up here, so on the left is students' SAT scores along the bottom, and then their first year college GPA along the y-axis. So you can see pretty strong predictor, right? The higher a student's SAT score, the stronger their first year college GPA is. And, you know, schools are in the game of trying to find students who will be academically successful on their campus. So SAT scores, for all of their flaws, are a pretty darn good predictor of how that student's going to do in their first year. You can see on the right-hand side, that green dot over to the right, that were students that did not submit an SAT or ACT score. They were kind of in the middle, right? On the right, the orange graph, yellow, orange, whatever color that is GPA along the bottom, their high school GPA along the bottom, first year college GPA along the left-hand side. It doesn't really correlate as much. A little bit. The line's not totally flat, but high school GPA is not nearly as good a predictor of how a student's going to do as SAT or ACT scores. And actually the best predictor many schools have found is the two things together. If you create a metric that combines a student's GPA with their test score, that's actually a really good predictor. So schools are kind of operating in this vacuum, and you're starting to see the pendulum swing back. This is just a handful of headlines from the last couple weeks, last couple months. A bunch of schools, and there are many more, have now gone back to test required. Not so much because they want to, because there are many things about test optional that's actually great for colleges, but what they're finding is their admissions officers are struggling to make decisions and to look at those fine differences between students because they have grades that mean less than they used to, and in many cases, no test scores. That's making it really challenging. And they're actually finding in many schools that the effect on equity and diversity is that test optional is actually hurting that instead of helping it, which was what many people hoped it would do. So that's kind of where we stand at this moment. As schools return to test required, more students are submitting scores again. So 38% more students submitted a score, SAT or ACT, in this current cycle than they did in 2021. And you can see that darker blue gray line is how many students reported scores. The bluish lighter blue line is how many did not. You can see that the did not is starting to level off and go down as the submitted scores is catching up pretty quickly. One other important note before we move on to SAT, ACT, a lot of parents hear test optional, parents and students hear test optional and think, oh, great, it's a test optional school, or all the schools on my list are test optional. I don't need to worry about testing. So the important thing to know is even in a test optional school, often, and if you're in any of these situations listed on this slide, often schools do still require or very much prefer a score. So some schools will say we're test optional, but not for nursing or not for business or not for computer science. Schools will say they're test optional except for athletic recruiting situations. The NCAA no longer has a test score requirement. I wouldn't be surprised if they go back to it at some point, particularly for you, those of you with younger kids in the room. But at the moment, they do not have a test requirement. However, coaches, we have parents call us all the time saying the coach said my kid is in if I can come back to him with an ACT of 32. So that often is a requirement even at a test optional school. Merit scholarships typically depend on test scores, not always, but many do. There's a great program in Florida called the Bright Futures program that SAT and ACT scores are a huge part of, pretty giant scholarship opportunities in Florida. They also can be a factor in course placement. If you have a strong SAT math score, you might test out of an entry-level math course once you get to a school. Some big state schools are requiring test scores for out-of-state students or international students, but not for in-state students. And then homeschooled students are sometimes being required to submit tests. So I say all that to say, be cautious as your students forming their list and make sure that you really read the details of a school's policy, because sometimes the headline says test optional, but the details may or may not mean that it's test optional for your student's situation. So that's the story on test optional. The next thing I wanted to focus on, now that I've hopefully convinced you that tests matter, which is not to say they are perfect. Don't take this as I love tests and think they're awesome. I don't. However, I do think they have utility in this process and are important. The next question is SAT or ACT. And there are sort of two things to this. How have the tests changed? Because as I said, both have undergone pretty sea changes in the last year or so. ACTs is still ongoing. And then how do I decide, either as a student or as a parent guiding a student? So in terms of changes to the tests, the digital SAT rolled out last year in 2024. Last March was the first administration of it. They did a full-on change. So once they hit the switch, old SAT was gone, paper SAT was gone. It was fully the new version and 100% digital. So going forward, forever and ever until they change it again, the SAT will be digital. There's no option to do it on paper except for certain learning disability accommodation situations. What other changes did they make? Number one, they shortened it. So they took it from 3 hours and 10 minutes, I think it was, down to about 2 hours. That's a pretty dramatic difference. One of the most difficult things about these tests can be for some students, just the endurance side of sitting there and focusing for 3 hours. It's not something students do a lot. It's not something we do a lot as adults in some cases. So that shortening really was a pretty big change for students and changed a lot of our focus on preparation for a test. Before was often on endurance, making sure you're still on it by hour 3. That's less of an issue now. They also made it stage adaptive, which is kind of complicated, but basically means every kid at the beginning of the reading section gets a chunk of questions that are at the same level across every student. If they do well on that first subsection in math, for example, the next section is harder questions. If they struggle in that first part, the next section is easier questions. And then the same process repeats on the reading section. Same level for the first half. If you do well, it goes harder for the second half. If you don't do well, it gets easier. So that's a change, and again, affects how students can feel through the test. Sometimes they feel those questions getting harder and they can get kind of panicky. Sometimes they see questions that feel easy and they worry they bombed the first one. So there's a bit of a kind of anxiety management game that has changed a little bit with this change. The SAT also gave more time per question in the new version. That comes into play in a second when we talk about ACT. They slowed it down a little. Not dramatically. There's still time pressure for sure, but they slowed it down a little. They added a built-in calculator for math and a sheet of formulas. And for reading, they pretty dramatically shortened the passages. Many of you who took the SAT years ago remember like a full page of text with numbered section, numbered lines, and then 4, 5, 6 questions about that passage. That's all gone. In the new version, it's a pretty short passage, mostly so they don't want students to have to scroll on the screen. So it's like a paragraph-ish, and then 1 question per passage. So those were kind of the changes meant to modernize the test, adapt it more to how students learn today, and ideally make it as predictive as possible. So those changes are all in the rearview mirror and everybody's using them. The ACT, on the other hand, is in the middle of this transition. They chose to do their transition in a messier way, more complicated way, which is they're kind of doing it in this staged approach, which I'll show you in a second. But once we get to the new enhanced enhanced ACT, it will have fewer questions and a shortened length. They followed the SAT's lead there and went down to 2 hours-ish. They added more time per question. The asterisks are because we're going to talk in a second about it's still a faster test. So it is still a test that if a student has difficulty with timing or tends to run out of time or is stressed out by timing, still the SAT is a safer bet in most cases. They did give a little more time, but still more rushed than the SAT. This was a huge one. They made the science section optional. It remains to be seen how colleges are going to react to that. Just because the ACT made it optional doesn't necessarily mean colleges are going to make it optional. So we've already heard from MIT that they're almost certainly going to require it. I have a feeling that other science engineering types of schools will keep it as a requirement, but from ACT's perspective, it's optional. And for better or for worse, they say that they are not getting rid of paper. They say forever. I don't know that I believe them, but they claim that they're going to forever offer a paper option and a digital option. So their test is not adaptive, like we talked about on the SAT, because it has to be able to continue to be given in the paper form. So once this transition is done, you'll be able to choose as a student registering whether you want paper or digital, but it will be this enhanced, shorter test with the science section optional and a little more time. The rollout timeline, again, it's making everyone's head spin a little bit, but just for those of you, particularly this is relevant to current juniors, not really relevant to younger kids, which is this spring, the April, June, July summer tests. The paper ACT is the old one and the digital ACT is the new one. Kind of confusing. I have a daughter who's a sophomore who's going to be abroad next year, so she's taking the old paper ACT to get it done with. But as we get into September, you see both paper and digital are the fully new version. So the last administration of the old ACT will be the July paper-based, and then it goes away forever. So important to know if you're thinking about doing prep this spring or summer, if your student's in that boat, you have to kind of make a decision about your path with ACT to make sure you're prepping for the right test. So with all of that, to get back to our question, which is, okay, that's all great. How do I choose? It's actually a fairly simple answer. This slide doesn't make it look simple, but it's actually fairly simple. I ask parents 2 questions when they're trying to choose, or students. Number 1, how good are you at math? if you are a math kid or your student is a math kid, you're strong at math, generally your math scores are pretty strong. In probably 80% of cases, you're going to like and do better on the SAT. The SAT has two sections, it's half math, half reading. So that math makes up 50% of your score. On the ACT side, back to this is science optional or not question, it has either 4 sections if you take science, only one of which is math, or if you don't take science, it has 3 sections, only one of which is math. So math is either a quarter of your score or a third of your score, depending on how science plays out. So it's a smaller piece of the overall score. So if you have a great math score, you can highlight it on the SAT and hide a low score on the ACT. Parents sometimes ask me, but what about the science section? That sounds mathy. It's actually not really. It's really more kind of reading comprehension with a science theme, kind of critical reading with a science theme, some kind of charts and graphs and math-ish, but it's really not a math section. So again, if math is a strength, SAT is usually your better bet. If English, language arts, reading is your strength, typically ACT is a better bet. So that's kind of question number 1. Question number 2 is this timing piece we talked about. Again, they did get a little closer together in their timing in the new version, but it is still true and very noticeable that the SAT is a slower paced test than the ACT. So if you're a student where time is an issue, timing stresses you out, you tend to run out of time, and you don't have any accommodations, often the SAT is a better bet because it's a little bit longer per question. Some students may have a real digital or paper preference. Again, no more options on paper for SAT. There are options on ACT for paper. And then sometimes the calendar and the dates come into play. So these tests are offered 7 or 8 times a year at kind of scattered dates. So depending on what your student's schedule is, it may be that one or the other fits your calendar better. So that's always important to kind of compare. In the summer, for example, only ACT has a July test date and only SAT has an August test date. Once we get to the fall, they both have one pretty much every month. But if you're planning summer prep, knowing that ACT is July, kind of mid-July, and SAT is last week-ish in August, may matter in terms of your timeline. So those are the key things to think about. Math or no math, math or reading strength, speed overall, and pacing. Do you care about paper or digital? And then is there anything on the calendar side that would matter? So that's kind of how you get to a decision. You can take, and we'll talk about this later, we offer at StudyPoint free practice tests. You can take both tests, and there's a chart that will compare an ACT score of X converts to an SAT score of Y to give you a sense of comparison. I have found in my conversations with families, talking through these factors, like 95% of the time gets you to the same answer that a practice test would get you and saves you a chunk of time trying to take both tests. So you can take practice tests and compare scores, but again, often a well thought out conversation can get you to the same answer. Okay, last section, how are we doing on time? Okay, good. Last section is around, okay, so we've talked about test optional, test preferred, test required, test blind, and then SAT versus ACT. Should my kid even take these tests? Particularly if you know that your kid is not a strong test taker. Obviously, if your student is a strong test taker and excels at tests, of course you're gonna have them take it. But parents ask us this question every day, should my student take the test at all? Our answer, and my answer as a parent to my friends as well, is everybody should try it. You can take practice tests again through us or other companies. You can take a real test and not send the score if you want to, but it's good to know where your student stands. These tests are pretty unique and they're pretty different from state testing you may have in your state throughout high school, pretty dramatically different from most classroom-based kinds of tests. So you may think you have a good bead on where your student will be, but there's no way to know for sure until they take one. So we typically recommend, even if you're not sure you're going to submit a test, even if you're pretty sure you're going to apply mostly to UC schools or schools where testing is not a factor, it's good to have a baseline and kind of know where you stand. And it's pretty easy to get a baseline. Then the next question is, okay, should my kid do test prep? Obviously, I work for a company that does test prep, but so this is a slightly biased answer, but the answer is sometimes, not always. The first question is, how far are you from where you want to be? So this is our averages for with our typical 30-hour program. We typically see gains of around 4-ish points on the ACT, around 175, 180 on the SAT. That's an average across 50,000 students over time. So any individual situation can vary. But, if you are very far from where you want to be, it might not be worth doing prep. It might not be enough to get you to the score that you want. You may need to reconsider your college list. If you're really close, if you're, 20 points from your SAT target or 1 point from your ACT target, you probably can do Khan Academy or self-study and get you where you need to be. So it's a little bit of kind of how much distance do you have to cover. Another key thing is what's your timeline? We say you should allow 2 to 5 months for prep. You can cram it in shorter amounts of timeline, but it's not going to be as effective. Like anything else, these are skills that your student is building that are going to help them not only on the SAT or ACT, but with other standardized tests they're going to have to take. I talk about test prep as you're learning strategies, test taking strategies, time management, and anxiety management. Time management, anxiety management, and test strategies come into play in lots of things in life. So these skills are not isolated only to these specific tests. But like learning any new skill, they take time. There's no miracle cure. There are no shortcuts. So if you are on a deadline and you have 2 weeks until the test, I would say don't embark on prep. You're probably not going to get enough out of it. The other thing to think about is how does your score kind of line up with your student's GPA? If you have a 4.0 student who's scoring in the 40th percentile on these tests, chances are they've got really good room to improve because their performance in the classroom is kind of outpacing their performance on the test, which would lead me to think, okay, there's potential there. If on the other hand, you have a C student and their scores are kind of in the C range, in the 40 or 50th percentile range, you could do some prep and probably improve it, but you might not see the level of increase that you might be hoping for. Another key thing is to think about kind of the ROI, the return on investment of test prep. If merit aid is a factor, test prep pays off quickly. So, the difference between a 1,500 and a 1,550 or a 1,560 in the world of merit aid and academic scholarships can be thousands and thousands of dollars and make a few thousand spent on test prep well worth it. If your student is not in a category where merit aid is going to be a factor, or athletic scholarships or other kinds of scholarships are not in play, it may not be as worth it for you. And then the last thing is kind of how set is your student on a particular school or schools? If your student has a really long, kind of diverse college list, and they're excited about lots of options on there, and there are some options that might be test blind and some that might be test optional, some that are test required, you probably are going to end up with an option in that pile that you feel good about. So test prep may not be necessary. If, however, the list is pretty competitive, or you might need to make up for a GPA that isn't quite what you'd hoped it would be, then testing and a strong test score can be a really big advantage. Then the big question. So let's say you've taken the test, you've done some prep, you're at what you think is your best score you can get. Should I submit it? So the short answer is, if you're happy with your score and it makes sense in the context of the school you're applying to, yeah, you should absolutely submit it. We've seen an increase in kids submitting scores, pretty dramatically high percentage of kids who get accepted have submitted scores. So it's only going to help you, even if it's not the most fabulous score you could ever dream of. So if you're happy with your score, if the college is pretty competitive, if merit money, as we talked about, or athletic scholarships are a possibility for you or in your world of thinking, you should submit. If your scores are at or above a college's average, you can go on lots of websites and see their average scores. A great one that I always recommend is College Simply, Simply, College Simply. They have a really easy tool. You can look it up. It's not a company that's associated with us. They just do a nice job. You can look up a school and it'll tell you what their score range is. If your score is in that range or above it, submit. If your score enhances your profile, again, maybe you had a little bit of a rough GPA in junior year, but your test score is really stellar. That's great. That's going to give the colleges one more clue that's going to make them confident that you can be successful academically on their campus. So that's a good thing. Also, if you're applying to STEM majors, Popular majors I mentioned before, things like nursing, business, computer science, those often, even within a less competitive, larger school, those are often very competitive programs. So in that case, again, if you have a score you feel good about, it's going to be that extra piece that's going to help you stand out. On the flip side, if you're not happy with your score, either because you don't feel like it truly represents you, it detracts from your academic profile, or your scores are below the 30th percentile for admitted students. Again, you can see that many schools will put it on their website. You can see it at College Simply. So if the range for a school is 1300 to 1380 and you're at a 1250, it's probably not going to help you. So in that case, we would probably recommend not submitting it, at least not to that school. And you can decide on a school by school basis. You don't have to submit to everybody or submit to nobody. You can decide, I'm going to submit my score to these schools and I'm not going to submit my score to other schools. So if you feel like your school is kind of below your academic profile, kind of underrepresents your GPA, then we would recommend not submitting it. Other thing to know is that when schools are looking at your overall college profile and your testing in particular, they're looking at it in a holistic way, and the local context matters. So one thing that we hear from admissions officers all the time is, if based on your high school or the region of the country you're in, colleges expect you to have taken a test and the score isn't on the application, they're going to know it wasn't great, right? Even if they say, we're not going to hold it against you, and I think they do mean that, it's hard not to. I joke with people sometimes that, it's like you're on a dating app and there's no picture, right? You're going to assume if there's no picture, there's probably a reason and it's probably not good, right? So that's the same sort of thing. If you go to a school in either a state where SAT or ACT are required, there they know for sure you took it. Some cases it's on your transcript, or a place where they know that all the kids are taking these tests and it's not on there, they're going to assume you took it and it wasn't good. So admissions officers tell us that the local context matters in the holistic review. If, on the other hand, you go to a school where many kids do not go to a four-year college or are not taking the test, it might be more understandable that you didn't take it, but they're going to make some assumptions about the situation. So that's just kind of an extra caveat, even in schools where they say, we are test optional, we will not hold it against you. Again, they're looking at the whole picture and they're going to make some assumptions based on what they see in your profile. Okay, one more section, timeline. So let's talk a little bit about timelines. I think a lot of you were sophomores in ninth grade, so I'll go kind of quickly through the juniors. Again, Chuck's going to send you guys these slides as well, so you'll have them. We also have a resource that lays out these timelines in kind of a PDF form. So I'm going to go through these kind of fast, but this is kind of our basic recommendation on timeline. So if your student is a current junior, so in April a junior, going into senior year, the key thing to think about is early decision, early action, and/or athletic recruiting a factor? If it is, you're going to want to prep sooner rather than later and try to be done at the latest during the summer before senior year. So now is a great time to take a practice test, figure out what you want to do, where you want to go with it, do your prep, April through July, take a July ACT, or May through August, take an August SAT. That gives you the September and October test dates if you need them. The SAT added a September date for the first time ever this year. So both tests have a September date and both have an October date for the first time. So those can be kind of in your back pocket if you need them. But really the focus should be get that done this spring and summer. If you know you are only applying regular decision, meaning the deadlines are at the end of December, typically, sometimes early January, you have a little more time. So you can do your prep through the summer and early fall, and or keep going into later fall and early winter. For early decisions, typically schools will definitely accept through the October testing date. A handful will even accept November. Again, you should check with the specific schools. If you're going regular decision, you have all the way through December to complete the testing. So that's for juniors who are becoming seniors. If you're a year earlier, so if you're a current sophomore about to become a junior in the fall, here the key thing to think about is really Algebra 2. Algebra 2 is kind of the key to the timeline here because the SAT and the ACT essentially only cover through the end of Algebra 2. Once you move on into pre-calc, 99.9% of what you're learning is not on these tests. And in some cases, the further you are in math, the lower your math scores can be on these tests because you've forgotten some of the stuff that's covered, which is algebra 2, a bit of geometry, pre-algebra, kind of basic math. So, some kids could be in calculus by the time they're taking the test, and you think, oh, they're going to ace the math section, and they're actually really rusty. So, our recommendation is if you are taking algebra 2 now in your 10th grade year, finishing it basically, almost at the end, like what we just talked about with the year above, the time for test prep is now. Do a practice test, kind of get going, do your prep through the summer. You'll take the PSAT in October. Almost all students in the US take it. And then take an early fall, August, September, October SAT or ACT. That gives you the winter and spring for additional tests if you need them. Maybe you don't, maybe you do, but it kind of gets you done a little bit earlier so that you're really doing the prep in close proximity to that algebra 2. If, however, you're taking algebra 2 next year, so in your 11th grade year, it's really a totally different story, which is don't do test prep yet. Wait, because it's difficult in a test prep situation, whether you're working with us, another company, self-studying, to learn the math while also trying to learn the test taking strategies. So if you're an 11th grader taking algebra 2, you really want to wait to prep until kind of the springish of next year, once you have the majority of that algebra 2 under your belt. If you want to get a jump start, focusing on math skills can be great now. Doing some general test taking practice. Again, some of that strategy work, kind of anxiety management, time management, those are skills you can start building before you're doing actual prep for the actual tests. But you're really going to want to wait until you have most of algebra 2 under your belt. Some companies will sell you test prep earlier. It's just not as effective, and it's going to end up taking you more time and more money because you're going to have to learn the algebra 2 while you're going through the course in school. And then if you're a ninth grader, currently in the spring of your ninth grade year, sort of the same question, which is really ninth grade and the summer before your sophomore year, things like executive function skills, math skills can be a good building block. There's a calculator called Desmos. That's an online calculator that's now in both tests, SAT and ACT. It's a great thing to get familiar with if your school doesn't use it. You can work on test taking strategies, reading comprehension, take some PSAT practice tests. But really, the kind of true test prep, like we were just talking about, you really don't want to begin until you're most of the way through algebra 2. So depending on where in your school's kind of sequence of courses you are, there is such thing as doing it too early if you don't have that algebra 2 under your belt. There is a disadvantage to waiting too long. We kind of talked about this. Prep does take time. We get calls all the time from parents saying like, my kid's taking it in 10 days. Can you prep them? It's like, well, we can do a little, but that's really not ideal. Again, these are strategies that take time to build. And in order for it to be effective, you want to plan ahead and have time. As we talked about, the further algebra 2 is behind you, the rustier your math skills get. So keep an eye on that. You don't want to wait too long and find that you're into calculus and some of those skills are rusty. And then whenever possible, and it's not always possible, but whenever it is, we really recommend being done with your test prep by August going into your senior year. That senior year fall has so much other stuff. Again, speaking from firsthand knowledge as a parent, there are a lot of things going on academically, socially. You're working on your applications, you're working on your essays, you're doing interviews, you're making decisions. So having testing under your belt and done with August of going into your senior year, the August between junior and senior year, is really a great place to be. So that's what we typically recommend. And I would just close by saying stronger test scores are going to give you more options. They'll give you more options on the scholarship side. They'll give you more options in terms of schools. So even students who come to us and say, I'm not a good test taker, these are skills you can learn. There are things you can practice. There are things you can do. It is a very teachable set of skills. So the sooner you start to think about it and do practice, the more you'll be set up to have a strong test score, which is just going to open doors across the board. So that is kind of my main spiel. Chuck, were there any questions that I can field?
Thanks, Katie. What a lot of great knowledge and information for the community here. I have some of my own. I've asked a few times, but do not see any questions currently. So I'll take this time just to, because we did have some later arrivals. If you do have a question for Katie, please feel free to put it in the actual chat box here, which we just got one here. I'll just read it right out. I'm
Sure.
wondering how much more preparation is required to prepare for both SAT and ACT.
Yes, great question.
Um, yeah.
Yep. So I'll answer the question you didn't ask, which is, should I take both? I didn't really answer that question. Short answer is no, not really. There are no schools in the country that require one or the other, all accept both equally. That's a change from when all of us were applying to college. So there is no school that will require or prefer one or the other. Schools will tell you, send us whichever one highlights your strengths the best, whichever one, is your better score. So we generally don't recommend taking both tests unless you're taking a practice test of both to figure out where to focus. They are similar. I sometimes describe them as Burger King and McDonald's, not Italian food and Chinese food, right? They're pretty similar. There are some differences. Each has kind of its own set of flavors, but they're not two totally different tests. So in the rare case where a student has done prep for one, taken it, and then wants to give the other one a try, we have a 4-lesson kind of add-on sort of review program that basically says, okay, you did all that stuff for test A. Let me explain to you the handful of differences on test B. And again, it's probably 70 or 80% of what you learn is applicable to both tests. Again, the strategies, the time management, the kind of anxiety management, a lot of the math is pretty similar. So you can do some quick review and kind of get a sense of the other test. But again, our advice is don't waste your time and money unless there's a really good reason to do so. Pick one right from the outset and kind of go down that road. Really, no great reason to take both.
Thanks, Katie. That's great advice. While we still might be getting a few more questions in the chat, I wanted to ask a few that I know I get sometimes that I feel having you on and your expertise could definitely shed light. Some of the first time that students and parents are exposed to standardized tests are when their high school may offer the PSAT and MSQT.
Yep.
We didn't really talk about it here in this presentation, but I
Sure.
wanted to know if you could just explain what this is, and does the ACT have also a test that they offer similar to that?
Yeah, great question. So the PSAT and MSQT, the world's longest acronym, is given to almost all, with a few small exceptions, juniors in October of your junior year. And it really serves a couple of purposes. One is it gives you as a student or you as a parent a baseline score. It's going to give you a score. It's scored on a slightly lower scoring scale, but theoretically, according to the College Board's research, the score you get on the PSAT corresponds to exactly what you would get if you took the SAT on the same day. So no prep. So if you get a 1480 on the PSAT, that means if you had taken the SAT the same day, you would have gotten approximately a 1480. So it gives you a bit of a baseline. It gives the student kind of a dry run of practice. It's a similar format, similar content. It's just a little shorter and a little easier. So it's a good kind of place to start when you're starting to think about testing, and a good place for kind of a practice stress rehearsal. So that's one purpose. It also is the kind of key to opening up the National Merit Scholarship Program, which many of you may have heard of, which is a pretty complicated multi-phase process, but that starts with that PSAT score being above a certain level. The level you need depends on your state and depends on the year. They release new kind of scoring benchmarks each year for each state. And so if your child's score on that 11th grade PSAT is above that benchmark, they then go into a pool, and then there's sort of a series of hoops they have to jump through. They have to get a confirming score on an SAT, and then they have to go through an application process. If they go through all of that and they get to the National Merit Scholarship point, I think the National Merit Scholarship itself is $2,000, could be $2,500, I can't remember. And then it also sometimes opens up other merit scholarship opportunities at schools, at organizations, at companies, separate from the scholarship run by the NMSQT organization itself. So that's the second set of purposes. The third set of purposes, and really the reason why it exists, is it's really a marketing tool. So when your student does the PSAT, there's a box in there they can check that says essentially, let colleges send me stuff. And as the parent of a kid who just took it, she checked the box, and man, has she been inundated with brochures, with emails. It's a college marketing tool. They buy that list. They know what your score was on the PSAT, and they then market to you appropriately. That can be a great thing because it can give you insight into schools you haven't heard of, schools you don't know a lot about. It can also be an annoying deluge of junk mail, depending on how you view it. So colleges like the PSAT because they're able to buy that list to then market to. There is also a similar thing for the ACT. It's called the pre-ACT. It's less broadly adopted, a little less well known, does not have the scholarship component to it, but does have the same kind of dry run, practice run aspect and the same marketing aspect as well. Some schools offer that in the spring of sophomore year, and some schools offer it in the fall of junior year. It's really up to the individual high school to do that. Also, one other thing on the PSAT, I can't remember if I said this in the presentation. Some schools also offer the PSAT in October of sophomore year, again, as like a dry run of the dry run. Our advice is take it. That one especially has totally no stakes to it. More experience with these tests is better. It will give you some diagnostic information about your student's score. Not all schools offer it to sophomores, but if they do, take it.
Katie, I'm so glad that you brought up the fact of the marketing aspect. A lot of times with the Paradigm Scholars, we recommend that before a student signs up to take the official PSAT, I would encourage them to have a separate email dedicated for college. It's
Absolutely.
already hard enough to get young people to check email nowadays, but when they realize that they either put their school or their personal email and they get bombarded with
Yes.
any and all colleges afterwards, I then have to then focus and shift to teach them how to filter their emails, and then
Important
teach them
life
how to
skill also.
unsubscribe. Yeah, great lifelong skills there with that. Two
Yeah.
other quick questions. I know we're
Yep.
nearing our time here. Um, Super scoring.
Oh, yes.
Colleges say they do super score, but what does that mean? And then in
Yep.
theory, how many times should a student take their test? Is there any data that shows that you should do it two, three, four times? Because you
Yep.
mentioned senior year is very, very busy, and I can attest that it is as well. What do you recommend, Katie?
Yeah, great question. So on the first question, yes, super scoring is basically means, let's imagine you took the SAT 3 times, and on the first time you had a great reading score, the second, but not such a great math score. The second time you had a great math score, but not such a great reading score. And the third time, maybe you had kind of middle in both. Many colleges, although not all, super score, which means they will take you will report your highest ever reading and your highest ever math and add them together, even if they weren't taken on the same day. So to take a step back, colleges have 3 different kind of score reporting policies that they offer. One set of schools offers super scoring, which is what we just talked about. So they super score, you put it in and it's all set. Another set of schools are what we call send all schools. Georgetown is the most commonly known one of them, but there are a handful of others. Those schools require you to submit every score you've ever done. So even if you took the test for practice as a 9th grader, that handful of submit all schools, we're going to ask you to submit every single score you've ever seen. Every single score you've ever taken. So they're going to see them all. A third set of schools, and it's probably bigger than submit all but smaller than super score, are schools that ask you to submit your best single day score. So in that example I gave before, they're going to look at your 3 totals and say, give me your highest total on a single day. So again, this is where really knowing your list and going in and looking at a school's specific policies is super important, because schools have any one of those 3 setups depending on what they want to do, and they can change year to year. So that's what super scoring is. Again, I would say the majority of schools, 75% maybe, I'm kind of making that up, but it's something like that, do super score, but not all. On your second question, how many times to take it? We generally say 3-ish is good. In an ideal world, you take a baseline score with us, you do some prep, you take it once, you're happy with your score, you're done. That makes everybody the happiest. There's no reason to take it more times if you've done solid prep, you've put in good effort, you've taken the test, and you've done well. Most kids want to give it another try, or they take a test partway through their prep process to kind of see where they are. So they might start prep in April, take the June and kind of see where they are, finish their prep in July or August, and then be done. And then in some cases, it may be worth taking a third time, particularly if you had a bad day. Kids are human. So, they wake up in the morning and don't feel well. They have a bit of a panic attack. You hear stories about like kids sitting next to them was fiddling their pencil the whole time. The fire alarm went off. There was a whole bunch of power issues at an SAT administration recently. So things can go wrong, which again is another reason why starting earlier is better, because if you need that kind of escape hatch of one more testing option, you have the time to do it. Generally, we say no more than three. Again, unless there's an extraordinary situation going on, more than three, the research has shown that you're generally not going to improve very much after that point. Sometimes we have kids come to us who have taken two or three and haven't improved and then want to do prep and take it again. We can do that in some cases, but typically three is kind of your max.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. Just one more quick question, and I don't see any more in the chat. So after this, we can wrap up if you don't mind. Um, if there's any students that are joining us that go to a school outside of the United States and maybe English is not their first language, are there any other specific considerations that you might give for these students to not only prepare but also register for the test?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not super familiar with international testing, other than to say the ACT has been digital in the international testing world for several years. So they were sort of the guinea pigs a little bit on the move to digital, and it has gone quite well internationally. Countries offer the ACT and the SAT. Many of them have similar sets of test dates, although they can vary a little bit. So the tests are offered internationally, both at international schools and also at regular high schools. So the key would be to go on to the College Board's website or the ACT.org site and look in the country where you are. We sometimes have kids who are traveling and want to take it out of the country, even if they're not living out of the country or they're studying abroad. That is an option. As I mentioned, my daughter will be abroad next year and it's offered where she's going. So you can take it from other countries. And the prep process is pretty much the same. You're going to go in, you're going to register for a date, and then back up a couple months to work on prep. Many schools require, as I think I mentioned, the SAT or ACT for international students, even if they are test optional for US students. Fair or not, that's sometimes their policy. Some schools may also require the TOEFL, which is the test of English as a foreign language, I think is what it stands for, which is essentially an English fluency test. Some schools require both together. Some schools require one or the other. So again, super important to check the schools on your list and specifically look, most schools' admission sections will have a international students page that will give you that kind of information. So really making sure you understand the requirements of that specific school.
Oh, thank you so much, Katie. A lot of great information here. And so I don't see anything else in the chat. So if you want to feel free to
Great.
continue, and then I will show
Yeah.
the upcoming webinars for the Paradigm Scholars afterwards.
Perfect. Yeah, just in terms of what we do, I mentioned, the company a bit, but what StudyPoint, what we do is a whole range of tutoring options. Obviously, test prep. We do support for AP courses and exams. We offer academic subject tutoring in basically every course, kindergarten through college. Once in a while, we get stumped on one we can't do, but it's pretty rare. We have 400 academic tutors on staff who cover a really wide range of subjects. We also offer an executive function coaching and study skill support, college essay writing, and then admissions consulting services. And we are doing 2 offers for folks who have attended or are watching the recording tonight, a discount on our test prep packages through the end of April, and also a free SAT or ACT practice test and score consultation. So I know Chuck will send these out, but that QR code will take you to a form to fill out to make sure that you're able to get those discounts. So if you're interested, you can go through that to let us know.
Right. I'm going to, Katie, do you mind stop sharing? Then I'll quickly just wrap up here. And again, do want to say thank you to everyone here for joining us. A lot of great information shared. And I just want to Again, highlight that we have three other webinars that are be coming up throughout the rest of the spring. One on financial aid, another one specifically to for college-bound student athletes and how they can become discovered, and then another one for 5 game-changing resources that will help you own your college process. And if you have any questions on any of these webinars or how to reach me, feel free to reach out to me here. I also have a great resource guide for college-bound student athletes, a lot of great information. But as Katie mentioned, and I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be uploading this full recording and the presentation deck to the Paradigm Scholars Heartbeat platform, and I'll email everyone information on how to access that. But I want to say thank you again for sticking with us and joining us through many different parts of the country. And for Katie, especially, you're on the East Coast, so it is quite late. I do want to say thank you very much for joining us. A lot of great information. Even though I've been doing this for many years, I've learned quite a bit tonight as well. And do want to say thank you to everyone here. And if there's anything else, just reach out to me. But other than that, I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.